Civilization versus civilization. The Celts versus the Zhou Dynasty of China. What differences existed between the two? Which civilization was better? Let's find out. First things first, does each civ identify with being an actual civilization? Do they follow these 7 criteria? Do they have at least one city? The Zhou had Haojing, and the Celts had Edinburgh. Do they have a political or military structure? The Zhou had a feudal monarchy, and depending on when and where, or who you ask, the Celts had an oligarchy, monarchy, or republic. Was there a social structure? The Zhous had a king or wang on top, lords and warriors in the middle, and peasants who mostly did farming and some crafts near the bottom, with merchants and slaves on the very bottom. The Celts usually had a king, then landowners, followed by druids, generals, priests, then artisans and farmers. Lastly, there were slaves. Was there a division of labor? Pottery is one of the most famous things from ancient China. The only way it could have been made was if there was people who dedicated their lives to this craft. And the religious shrines built by the Celts are often overlooked in historical religions, but the Celts often built beautiful shrines, and again, the only way this would have been made possible is if there was a division of labor. Did they follow a religion? Ancient China focused on a lot of ancestral worship, and later moved into Confucianism, while the Celts focused on their own polytheism, commonly known as Celtic paganism. Did they have a form of writing? Ancient China had a script similar to the ones they have now, with some differences, called archaic cleric script, and the Celts have a form of calligraphy that has yet to have been fully translated. Did they have any art or do any science? As mentioned before, the pottery that comes from the Zhou Dynasty were some beautiful masterpieces that have been in tradition for centuries. The Celts were known for something a little bit more barbaric, as the Romans would have put it. The Celts built huge stone works called megalithic art and steles, or steles. I'm not 100% sure on how to pronounce that. So there's the proof. Both civilizations qualify as civilizations. Though civilization is a very general term, what are some big things that made them different? The biggest difference, I would say, would be the way of life for citizens in these two empires. Just in the way that things were ruled. Whereas both empires had an indirect rule, the way they went about ruling was still massively different. And what people had, what opportunities, the differences were astounding. The Chinese were mostly told what to do, and were led with a tight leash, living to believe their king or wang was right, and his word was law. The Celts, however, was varying from leader to leader, but because the Celts had so many different leaders, and the empire wasn't under strict control all the time, it tended to be more liberal. A lot of the going-ons in the Celtic Empire wasn't really held together by a single leader while the Celts were at their height. Mainly because how could one person rule all of this? That's a lot of land with a lot of varying culture. If you wanted to rule them all with an iron fist, you would have a lot of blood on your hands. Another big difference that existed between the two was military warfare. The Zhou Dynasty was the longest reigning dynasty in China. You don't achieve that accomplishment without being plenty of warfare. Most of the early Zhou kings were commanders-in-chiefs, and were constantly warring with barbarians. The Zhou's early armies were very strict and controlled, mainly being split into 2 major field armies for better control. The 6 armies of the West, and the 8 armies of Chengzhou. The Zhou also had tons of chariots to control their land, usually having 10 infantry attached to each chariot, with 5 of them riding on the chariot. The armor and weapons the Zhous used were mostly bronze during the beginning of their rule and iron near the end. The Celts, however, the Celts were savage. The Chinese wars were geared towards destroying barbarians, but the Celts were basically barbarians, especially when it comes to some of their tactics. The Celts were described by any other civilization they came across to be a reoccurring nightmare. One of the biggest tactics the Celts used to scare their enemies was to literally charge into battle with a spear or sword and shield whilst being completely naked. It takes some balls to do that. The Celts used weapons like javelins, slings, short and long swords, hammers, axes, etc., because if it could be used as a weapon, it would've. Hell, they even used wooden clubs. Much like the Zhous, the Celts also used chariots. But instead of transport, which they also used them for, they were more used militarily. The chariot riders had to be very agile, because they oftentimes had to crawl around the chariot in order to throw javelins at their enemies. As well as that, the riders were also used as a distraction or intimidation force, making loud noises as they rode past their enemy. Though all of this is cool, the bulk of the Celtic military tactics relied on something called the Furor Celtica by the Romans. Basically, what the Celts did was, en masse, as a single unit of people, charge their enemy, dead front, no strategy, no tactics, just wild, frenzied, vicious attack. And that's how the Celts won their wars. Now, both of these civilizations was great, and have many great accomplishments, but I'm gonna put forth the question, which was better? Now, to put things in a simpler light, I'm going to score them in a few different categories. Longevity, power, both offensive and defensive, greatness of their rulers, and a bit of personal bias. Now, longevity is a fairly short category, ironically, so I'll just get through it quickly. The Zhou Dynasty lasted 790 years, and was part of an empire that still lasts today, so they get a 90 out of 100. The Celts lasted around roughly 738 years, and started several empires that are still around today, so they get a 92 out of 100. Now for a harder question. Which had more power? We'll start with offense. The Zhou Dynasty had plenty of time to expand an already large landmass and make it bigger. Using the power of numbers and speed, they conquered their way across China, stopping everyone they came across with ease. Their greatest defensive strength lied within their well-organized army. It was working as a well-oiled machine, with every part working properly. It scores an 84 out of 100 from me. The Celtic offense was brutal. Absolutely brutal. To step up against the Celts would be like stepping up to a horde of wild animals, which the Celts often wore nothing but the skins of to instill that effect. For someone to try to fight an elite Celtic fighter would be like fighting death itself. The only downside, and is a big downside, is a big lack of tactics and strategy. Sure, there are examples throughout history that showed strategic masterpieces from the Celts, but those are few and far between. The Celts were animals, not a military machine, so I'm going to give them a 79 out of 100 in offensive military. Now, for defense. The Zhou Dynasty was never really in a defensive war, excluding the Warring States period, which could be considered something entirely different. The Zhous took and took and took, and were great at it, but it would be a silly idea for anyone to even try to attack them. So no one really did. The biggest flaw of the Zhous in defensive terms was that they were spread themselves too thin, and when the Warring States period rolled around, they were caught with their pants down. So in defense, I give them 64 out of 100. The Celts, however, have centuries of defensive experience, and for a large section of time kept at bay one of, if not the greatest military in the world, the Romans. It had to take one of the greatest leaders of all time, Julius Caesar, with one of the strongest armies of all time, to crack the Celts, and he couldn't even finish the job. The Celts, with less military technology, less resources, and less clothes, held off the Romans for hundreds of years. If it weren't for the Celts, the Romans might have been able to create a stable empire that might have survived to this day, but the Celts stopped that. I would score them with a solid 91 out of 100 on their defensive. And now, which country had the greatest leaders? The Zhou Dynasty mainly had King Wu. Most of the accomplishments achieved throughout the Zhou Dynasty was because of this one ruler. He brought the dynasty to greatness, and after him, the empire fell into decline for the next few centuries. His right to rule was brought about due to his mandate to heaven, and he used this to unite several tribes together to take down the Shang dynasty. Other than him, the other rulers have some footnotes through history, and eventually fell during the Warring States period. I rate them a 72 out of 100. The Celts had a multitude of different rulers that all accomplished missions they were born to do. I'll focus on two main ones, Vercingetorix and Boudica. Now, because of how the Celts ran things as a sort of collection of different peoples under the same sort of name, other than having a proper monarch or one sort of country, none of these leaders would have been rulers of all the Celts, just their tribe, really. But they were technically Celtic leaders, so nevertheless, let's begin. Now, we'll start in historical order, with Vercingetorix, who was the chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Now, he was designated the leader in the year 52 BCE. Now, this is a funny year because this was the last year of Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. Rome had basically taken control over all of Gaul at this point in time, but there was unrest. Riots and skirmishes often broke out from the Celtic people, and oftentimes it ended with gallons of Celtic blood spilt, with little Roman blood in return. However, when Vercingetorix became the chieftain of the Arverni tribe, he immediately allied with every other Gallic tribe he could, and led massive revolts against the Romans, the likes of which wouldn't have been seen for the next few centuries. He also accomplished one thing few other people in history can say they accomplished. He defeated an army led by Julius Caesar. Next, Boudica. Now, Boudica has a million different names with a million different pronunciations, but I'm just going to call her Boudica. To start things off, Boudica was the queen of the Iceni, but she became that in a weird way. Her original claim to fame was being the wife of Prestigus. Prestigus, who was the king of the Iceni people, and was an ally to Rome. Now, if history has taught us anything, it's that the Celts, and in this case the Iceni people, hate Romans. So one day, Prestigus goes and dies, like a dummy, though it's not 100% sure how. However, it doesn't matter. He's dead. Now, what Boudica, her two daughters, and the Iceni people thought was going to happen was the Iceni kingdom would be passed down to the two daughters, and the Iceni would remain allied with the Romans. However, the Romans believed that when Prestigus dies, Iceni just goes straight to Rome. So what ended up happening was, Prestigius dies, Roman soldiers come in, rape the two daughters, and beat Boudica half to death, and just say the Iceni belonged to Rome. Boudica lost her fricking mind. I mean, who wouldn't? But she, for lack of a better term, lost her shit. And she went on a religious nutface. She's been quoted to be seen capturing a rabbit, releasing it into the wild, and then interpreting how it runs as some sort of message from the gods. Inspired by rage and hate, she gathered with some other Celtic chiefs and started to formulate plans. She eventually built up an army of 100,000 Celtic warriors and led them into battle, destroying major Roman cities such as Verulamium and Londinium, which is where modern-day London is located. She managed to kill around 80,000 Romans and almost entirely expelled all Romans from the British Isles. Now, sadly, neither of these leaders managed to completely finish their jobs. However, they did do enough damage to permanently damage the Romans, playing a large part in their eventual downfall. Who knows? If it weren't for the Celtic leaders, the Romans might have been able to survive civil war, the Huns, and many other crises brought about after the Common Era. So I score the Celtic leaders 87 out of 100, though a large part of that might fall upon personal bias. So now, let's total up their scores. The Zhous have 310 out of 400. And the Celts have 349 out of 400. And the Celts win by a margin of 39 points. Can you believe it? Well, there you have it. A definitive answer on which civilization is better. I'm kidding, of course. A lot of the score was swayed by bias, and I barely scratched the surface of what makes one civilization better than the other. But for a definitive answer for this video, the Celts are better. I hope you enjoyed, have a nice day, and goodbye.